Abuse isn't always being hit or being screamed at or something really intense and dramatic like that. In fact, there are subtle ways of abuse that most people are accepting in their relationships day in and day out and don't even recognize it for what it is. If you want a conscious relationship, one of the things you have to do is really define what you're willing to tolerate and what you're not in relationships. And in this video, I want to talk about some subtle ways of abuse that we accept as normal and tolerate in our relationships every day. The first piece I want to talk about is criticism. And this reminds me of a friend of mine. This was several years back, but I was speaking with a friend of mine, and she told me that the guy she was with at the time, guy she was dating, he said to her that, you're pretty and you would look really good if you just lost a little bit of weight. And I thought about this, and I remember saying immediately, like, you don't deserve that, but that's besides the point. But I thought about this, and I thought about the implications of that, and I thought about how often this is happening to people in relationships, how often two partners are making these little criticisms and these little jabs at each other, and just little by little, very subtly, chipping away at each other's dignity, chipping away at each other's self-esteem. And whether it could show up in a lot of different things. It could show up as nagging, it could show up as talking down on them about decisions they've made. It could show up as talking down on them about the way they look or the things they say or their annoying habits, or it could show up like a lot of things. But what it really comes down to is criticism, the way I'm talking about it here in a relationship. It's not constructive criticism designed to build somebody up, but it's actually designed to make them feel bad about themselves. It's designed to make them feel less than. And I've seen many couples that anytime their partner is feeling good about themselves or feeling high or feeling, enjoying life, they see that and they've got to make a comment. They've got to find some way to chip at them or bring them down. And it's not a huge fight. It's not a screaming. It's nothing like that. It's just these little comments, these little maybe passive aggressive comments or subtle comments or little chips that they throw at each other. And then what happens is they're just chipping away at each other's dignity and each other's self-esteem. And they both feel really bad about themselves, and they ultimately feel bad about the relationship as a whole. This does not obviously support a loving relationship. I mean, that much is clear, but when we look at how often this happens and how much we tolerate it, and that's what's really scary. The next thing I wanted to talk about is punishment. And this goes hand in hand with criticism, but it's another subtle form of abuse where sometimes it shows up as criticism, but it could show up in different ways. It could show up as the silent treatment. It could show up as maybe going out with your friends and staying out all night. It could show up in different ways. But what happens is when our partner does something that frustrates us, that we don't like, that we get upset about, that we, whatever it might be, and they do something, and then we find a subtle way to punish them for it. It's not coming to them in an open spirit saying, honey, listen, you really did this, you did that, and that upset me, and this is what I'm feeling, and can we talk about that? It's nothing like that, but it's more like, okay, you did that, I'm gonna show you what I'm gonna do. And then we go out and we do something, or we don't talk to them, or we give them a cold shoulder, or we brush them off, or we get really short with them. Like I said, maybe we go out with our friends and stay out all night, so they're sitting home, well, what are they doing? What's going on? And rather than coming to the relationship with the problem, rather than bringing it to our partner, we isolate from them, and we close off, and we get cold, we get disconnected. And the goal here, just like criticism, is to make them feel bad, to make them feel guilty. Now, punishment is more of a revenge thing, whereas criticism is more of an offensive thing usually, although they sometimes go back and forth. But the idea here is that these are subtle forms of abuse. These are subtle ways that we destroy our partner's confidence, our partner's self-esteem. And what's really sad about this is that these events and these ways of dealing with things are so common that they're happening in so many relationships. Something my wife and I always talk about is that if you want to have a conscious relationship, you have to be really clear on your standards. You have to be really clear on the kind of relationship you want, on what you will accept in a relationship and what you won't. And you have to be willing to bring that to your partner and to work through that. And these are two things, this criticism and this punishment, that if you allow this stuff to go on in your relationship, it's going to chip away at the very foundation of what you have together. It's going to eat away at everything that was good about the relationship. And whether you're in a relationship or not, you've been through this, I'm sure, and you've probably witnessed it with your family. Very few of us had healthy role models, and then our relationships since we were younger, since we watched, maybe our parents doing relationships or other things, since we watched that, we haven't really seen a good example of relationships because our relationships usually just play out the same as our past, and because they usually perpetuate what we know rather than redefining what we know. And so most people, whatever the cycles they grew up with and the examples that they grew up with, they just perpetuate these cycles in their future relationships. And until you realize it, and until you look at it and go, wow, like me criticizing my partner criticizing me, that's not okay. Like that makes me feel awful, and it makes them feel awful. And that's not the kind of relationship I want. Me giving them the cold shoulder and brushing them off and ignoring them, or me getting pissed off and going out all night so they sit home and worry or whatever. Us having those kinds of behavior that day after day we just subtly chip away at each other. Day after day, we just subtly tear each other down. It's not a big attack. It's not a screaming. It's not a hitting. It's nothing like that. But it's just these subtle attacks that tear the two of us apart, that tear us down, that drive us away from each other. And when you can recognize this, and you can recognize that having a conscious relationship doesn't include those things, and you can recognize the kind of relationship you want. And again, whether you're single or whether you're in a relationship, it doesn't matter because we've all experienced these patterns. So the best thing to do, if you're single from the very beginning, when you see this stuff show up in a relationship, you interrupt it, you communicate about it, you say, I'm not gonna be okay with this. If you're in a relationship, the best thing you can do is you and your partner sit down together and you acknowledge these behaviors with each other. And you make a commitment together that, hey, we don't wanna do this anymore. And we're gonna really work, and if we need coaching, if we need whatever, we're gonna really work on these behaviors in our relationship so that we don't continue to do this to each other. And I want to invite all of you, whoever's watching, to a very special event. We're going to be hosting an event called Creating a Conscious Relationship, where we actually talk about a lot of the toxic behaviors, the toxic patterns, the toxic cycles that we're trapped in that are preventing us from having the kind of healthy relationship that we're looking for. And they're preventing us from having the kind of love we're looking for. And we're going to really dive into this conversation about what's going on in relationships that's preventing people from getting where they want to be with them. And how do we exit those cycles? How do we shift that? How do we get out of these perpetual cycles that keep us in the same destructive patterns that many of us have spent most of our lives in? We're going to be diving into this. It's a special presentation. It's absolutely free. All you got to do is go to myconsciousrelationship.com. myconsciousrelationship.com. You can register there. Space is limited. Do it soon. But I hope to see you in there. And thanks for watching.